You've been stuck inside for 3 days because of rain. You have a roof, you have heating, you have a refrigerator full of food, and a phone full of distractions. And you're miserable now. Remove all of that. Remove the roof. Remove the walls. Remove the stored food. The dry clothes, the waterproof jacket, the hot drink. Put yourself in a forest, somewhere in prehistoric Europe, 60,000 years ago, during a rainy season that doesn't end for weeks. The temperature is hovering just above cold, enough to kill you. Everything you need to survive fire, food warmth, becomes exponentially harder to obtain. The wetter it gets, how do you survive that? Not as a thought experiment, as a daily reality, as the baseline condition of being human, for the vast majority of human history. This is the question. Nobody thinks to ask about ancient humans, because we're usually too busy asking about the dramatic stuff, the predators, the migrations, the wars. But rain is unglamorous and relentless, and it was arguably more consistently dangerous to early humans than almost anything with teeth. It killed fires, it caused hypothermia, it rotted food, it flooded shelters. It lasted for months. And ancient humans not only survived it, they thrived in some of the wettest, most brutal climates on the planet. They crossed rainforests. They lived through ice age winters, with precipitation that would shut down a modern city. They figured out without textbooks or Gore-Tex how to keep a species alive, in conditions that would end most modern humans. Within days, let's find out how. Start with the most immediate problem rain creates for a human being without shelter. Not drowning, that's a different conversation. The real killer is heat loss. Water conducts heat away from the human body, roughly 25 times faster than air does. This is not a small difference. This is the difference between sitting in a cold room, feeling chilly, and sitting in a cold lake dying when you're wet. Your body is losing heat at a rate your metabolism may not be able to compensate for, especially if the ambient temperature is low and the wind is blowing. This is why hypothermia kills so efficiently, in wet conditions. Even when the temperature is nowhere near freezing, you don't need ice, you need wet clothes, a mild wind, and a temperature somewhere around 10 degrees Celsius. That's a British summer. That's a spring night in Central Europe. That's a perfectly ordinary day in dozens of environments where early humans lived and died. Ancient humans knew this, not from reading about thermodynamics, from watching each other die. The first and most critical survival skill in wet conditions isn't finding food or building shelter. It's maintaining core body temperature. And the strategies ancient humans developed to do this were more sophisticated than most people assume. Let's start with fire, because fire is the obvious answer, and also a deeply complicated one. In the context of rain, fire, and rain, our enemy's wet wood won't ignite. Wet tinder won't catch a fire that gets rained on dies, and a dead fire in a hypothermic situation is not an inconvenience. It is a death sentence written in wet ash. So how did ancient humans keep fire alive in the rain? The answer is that they thought about fire the way modern humans think about electricity, as infrastructure, not as an event. Fire wasn't something you made when you needed it. Fire was something you maintained continuously, because starting it from scratch in wet conditions, without modern tools, is one of the hardest things a human being can do. With bare hands, carrying fire was a practiced skill across virtually every ancient human culture that has been studied. Embers wrapped in slow-burning organic material, damp moss fungus, bark from specific trees could be carried for hours, while travelling the Inuit carried smouldering materials in enclosed containers. Indigenous Australians used specific, slow, burning woods to transport live embers across vast distances. Archaeological evidence from sites across Europe shows hearths that burned continuously, for years, not relit repeatedly, but maintained, fed, protected, treated as a living thing that needed tending. The fire was never allowed to go out, because the cost of losing it was too high. This required designated roles within groups. Someone's job in bad weather was to keep the fire alive, not to hunt, not to forage, to sit with the fire, shield it, feed it, and make sure the group didn't wake up cold and dark, in the middle of a rainstorm. This is one of the earliest divisions of labour. We can infer from the archaeological record. Before anyone was a specialist in tools, or hunting, or medicine, someone was a specialist in fire. But fire requires shelter to survive in heavy rain, which brings us to the second major strategy. Ancient humans were not the cave-dwelling, primitives of popular imagination, the cave-dwelling. Image is partly an artifact of preservation bias. Caves are where evidence survives, so caves are where we look, and therefore, we conclude that caves are where ancient humans lived. But caves are rare, often inhabited by predators. frequently cold and damp and geographically limited. Most ancient humans lived in structures they built, and those structures, even the earliest ones, show a level of environmental intelligence that is genuinely impressive. The oldest known constructed shelters date to around 400,000 years ago, long before Homo sapiens, in fact. These were not elaborate, but they were intentional. Branches angled to shed water, leaves layered in overlapping rows like shingles, each layer overlapping the one below, so rain runs off rather than through. The same principle as a modern roof, arrived at independently, with no engineering education by hominins, whose brain was somewhat smaller than yours, by the time anatomically modern. Humans were spreading across the globe. Temporary shelters had become remarkably sophisticated for the materials available. Mammoth bone structures found in Eastern Europe, dating to around 15,000 years ago, showed deliberate architectural thinking. Heavy bones anchored into the ground to resist wind, hides stretched across the frame, probable insulation layers inside. These weren't holes to hide in. They were engineered environments, built specifically to maintain heat and exclude moisture. The hide construction is worth pausing on because it represents one of the most important material innovations in human history, and it happened specifically as a response to wet, cold climates. Animal hides properly prepared are nearly waterproof. The fat content of untreated hide provides natural water resistance. When ancient humans began the process of turning raw hide into usable material, scraping, stretching, treating with fat or brains or urine smoking, they were essentially inventing leather. And leather as a material is remarkable. It's flexible, durable, thermally insulating when dry, and significantly more water resistant than woven. Plant fiber, the cognitive leap required to go from, this animal has a skin too. I can turn that skin into something that protects my skin, is not trivial. It requires understanding cause and effect across a delayed timeline. The animal is killed today. The hide is processed over several days. The finished product protects against weather. Weeks later, this is planning, abstract thinking, the ability to solve a problem that doesn't exist yet. But will ancient humans were doing this at least 120,000 years ago, based on archaeological evidence of hide-scraping tools found in Africa possibly earlier. The technology predates modern behavior, as typically defined by researchers, which suggests that the drive to stay dry was a significant enough evolutionary pressure to produce complex, cognitive solutions very early in human history. Rain didn't just kill ancient humans, it made them smarter. Now let's talk about something that gets almost no coverage. In the popular understanding of ancient survival, landscape reading modern humans experience, weather as something that happens to us. We check an app, we get caught in the rain. We go inside, we have essentially outsourced our weather awareness to technology and lost the underlying skill. Ancient humans had no such option. Their survival depended on reading the environment, continuously anticipating weather before it arrived, and making decisions based on observations that most modern people wouldn't even notice. The smell of rain before it comes. Petrichor is a real olfactory signal. So is the behavior of animals, which change hours before a storm. Birds fly lower, insects swarm. Certain animals move toward higher ground. The color and texture of clouds, the direction of wind shifts, the behavior of water surfaces, all of these carry real meteorological information. Ancient humans read these signals, the way you read road signs automatically, fluently because their lives depended on it. Group decisions about shelter and movement were likely made hours before rain arrived, based on this accumulated environmental literacy. You don't get caught in a downpour when you've been reading the sky all day, and you have 3 hours of daylight to find high ground and build a rain cover before the storm hits. This skill is so deeply embedded in the cognitive profile of traditional peoples that researchers studying indigenous communities today consistently find levels of environmental awareness that seem almost supernatural to observers from industrialized societies. A San bushman can read animal tracks and weather signs simultaneously and predict with reasonable accuracy what the next several hours will bring. This isn't magic, it's expertise. Specifically, it's the kind of expertise that emerges when weather. Awareness is the difference between life and death, practiced daily, refined over generations, transmitted through teaching and observation. We had this, we traded it for a weather app. The app is convenient, but something was lost. Now here's something that almost nobody talks about when discussing ancient rain survival: the specific geography of where ancient humans chose to make camp and how much of their survival came down to reading terrain rather than just reading sky. Elevation matters enormously in wet conditions. Cold air sinks, wet air pools in valleys on a rainy night. The difference between camping on a slight rise and camping in a hollow can be the difference between waking up damp and waking up sitting in several inches of cold water. Ancient humans understood this, the same way a modern plumber understands. That water runs downhill through continuous practical observation, with immediate consequences for getting it wrong. South-facing slopes in the northern hemisphere receive more sunlight and dry faster after rain. Tree canopy density determines how much rain actually reaches the ground beneath it. Dense broadleaf canopy can intercept a significant percentage of light to moderate rainfall entirely. Ancient humans camped under it deliberately. Dense conifer stands do the same. Certain rock formations create natural overhangs that have been used as shelters across every inhabited continent, not because ancient humans couldn't build, but because a natural overhang is a head start on waterproofing. That saves hours of construction time, the knowledge of which specific locations in a given landscape offered the best natural shelter from rain was accumulated over years of use and passed through generations. Groups returned to the same good sheltering spots, seasonally the same way. They returned to the same hunting grounds and foraging areas. This is evidenced archaeologically by sites that show repeated habitation across thousands of years, layers of ash bone and artifact stacked on top of each other at the same location. The spot was good. Everyone who came before knew it was good. They told the people who came after. Landscape knowledge was rain survival. They were inseparable. Let's talk about the body itself, because ancient humans also had physiological advantages in wet, cold conditions that we have partially lost through lifestyle, and that some modern researchers think we've lost more completely than we realize. The cold shock response is a good place to start. When you fall into cold water, your body undergoes an immediate cascade of physiological reactions: sharp inhalation, hyperventilation, cardiovascular stress. This is largely an autonomic response, and it's responsible for a significant number of cold water drowning deaths, including in people who are strong swimmers in warm water. The cold shock response is partly a learned sensitivity. People who are regularly exposed to cold water, cold showers, cold swimming, cold weather, show reduced cold shock responses over time. Their bodies adapt. Ancient humans were cold regularly, wet regularly, exposed to temperature variation daily, in a way that no modern human, in a climate-controlled environment, can approximate. Their baseline physiological response to cold and wet was calibrated by continuous exposure, in a way that ours simply isn't. They weren't tougher because they were different humans. They were tougher because they were trained humans, trained by an environment that didn't offer the option of turning up the thermostat. There's also the question of fat distribution and metabolic adaptation. Hunter-gatherer populations in cold, wet climates show metabolic profiles that differ from sedentary populations in climate-controlled environments. Higher resting metabolic rates in cold conditions, more efficient heat generation from brown adipose tissue, a type of fat that generates heat directly rather than storing energy. These adaptations are partly genetic, built up over generations of selection in cold climates, but they're also partly physiological, maintained by regular cold exposure. The Inuit are the most studied example, a population adapted over thousands of years to some of the wettest, coldest conditions humans have ever chosen to inhabit. Their metabolic adaptations to cold are well documented, but less well known is the fact that many of these adaptations are present, to a lesser degree, in any human who is regularly exposed to cold. Regardless of ancestry, the body responds to the demand. It always has. Ancient humans in wet, cold climates were not surviving despite their bodies. They were surviving with bodies that had been shaped over a lifetime and over generations, specifically to handle those conditions. Their baseline was different from ours, because their environment was different from ours. Not better humans, better prepared humans. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content, covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide. Included link in the description. See you inside. Now let's talk about the social dimension, because this is where ancient human rain survival gets genuinely interesting and almost never discussed. Surviving rain alone is hard. Surviving rain as a group is much more manageable. And the social structures of ancient human groups were built in part around the collective. Management of environmental threats, including weather. Shared body heat is a real survival mechanism. A group of humans huddled together under a rain cover generates and retains heat collectively, in a way that individuals cannot. The person on the outside is colder than the person in the middle. Ancient humans knew this sleeping arrangements in cold. Wet conditions were communal. Dense and pragmatic privacy is a warm weather luxury. When it's cold and wet, you sleep close to other warm bodies, and you don't think twice about it. The firekeeping role mentioned earlier was part of a broader system of weather-related labour. Distribution in groups studied by anthropologists. There is almost always an implicit allocation of tasks. During bad weather, younger, more physically robust individuals maintain and gather. Older individuals with more experience make decisions about movement and shelter placement. Children are kept central warm, protected by bodies around them. The group functions as a thermoregulation system, not just a social unit. This is why the image of the lone, ancient human surviving against the elements, is mostly a modern fiction. Solitary survival, in genuinely hostile weather conditions, without modern technology, is survivable for short periods by trained individuals, over weeks and months through a real rainy season. Humans survive as groups. The social bond was not a luxury feature of ancient human life. It was survival infrastructure. There's also the knowledge transmission angle, everything that worked: the fire-carrying technique, the hide waterproofing method, the reading of pre-storm animal behavior, the specific trees, whose bark burns slow enough to carry embers. None of this was reinvented by each generation. It was taught, passed from older individuals to younger ones, through direct instruction, observation, and practice. The accumulated knowledge of a group about how to survive. Its specific environment was one of its most valuable assets, possibly the most valuable. When a group lost its elders to violence or illness, it didn't just lose people, it lost institutional knowledge that couldn't be quickly replaced. The death of an experienced elder in a hunter-gatherer group was a survival event, not just a social one, which is likely one of the reasons that care for older, non-reproductive individuals appears in the archaeological record surprisingly early. Looking after people who could no longer fully participate in foraging or construction was not altruism in the abstract. It was the rational preservation of the group's accumulated rain. Survival knowledge now lets address food, because rain doesn't pause hunger, and foraging is sustained. Wet weather creates a specific set of problems that ancient humans had to solve with whatever the landscape offered. Prolonged rain changes the availability of food dramatically. Animals shelter and become harder to track and hunt. Plant foods that are normally reliable seeds, dried berries, roots that can be dug up, become waterlogged, hidden under mud, or simply inaccessible for days at a stretch. Fires needed to cook food are harder to maintain. The combination of reduced food availability and increased caloric demand from cold creates a nutritional squeeze that a group, without preparation, could not survive for long. Ancient humans managed this in several ways. First, through strategic food storage. Evidence of deliberate food storage appears deep in the prehistoric record. Caches of nuts, dried meat, preserved fish buried in cool locations, or stored in elevated structures, away from ground moisture. This is not instinct, it is foresight. It is the recognition that the season will change, that food available today may not be available tomorrow, and that the gap between those two conditions needs to be bridged by something other than hope. Second, ancient humans in wet conditions shifted their food targets opportunistically toward what rain actually produced. Earthworms surface in huge numbers after heavy rain. Freshwater fish move in predictable patterns. During flooding, certain mushrooms and fungi fruit prolifically in wet conditions. Snails, insects, frogs. All of these become more accessible in wet weather, precisely because they're also responding to the moisture. Ancient humans who were paying attention, and they were always paying attention, ate accordingly. The menu changed with the weather. Flexibility was not a personality trait, it was a survival trait. Third, and most importantly, the group ate together and shared equitably during lean periods. Hoarding food individually in a survival situation reduces the group's collective resilience. A well-fed individual in a group of starving people is not a survivor, they're a casualty, waiting for the rest of the group to fall apart. Ancient human sharing norms, visible in every hunter-gatherer society, studied by anthropologists, exist, partly because sustained cooperation through lean, wet, difficult seasons is what actually keeps everyone alive. The rainy season wasn't just survived, it was prepared for, adapted to, and shared. Let's zoom out one final time and look at the big picture of where ancient humans actually chose to live, because it tells you something remarkable about their relationship with wet weather. Modern humans, given a choice, tend to prefer moderate climates. Not too hot, not too cold, not too wet. This is visible in population density maps even today. Temperate, seasonally stable regions attract and hold more people than climate extremes. Ancient humans did not have this luxury. They went everywhere into monsoon-soaked Southeast Asia, into the perpetually wet, temperate rainforests of coastal Europe, into river delta systems that flooded seasonally, with predictable violence, into the subarctic where precipitation is relentless, and the ground is wet or frozen for most of the year. They didn't go to these places despite the rain. In many cases, they went because of what the rain brought. Wet environments are productive environments. Rivers and lakes fed by heavy rainfall are full of fish. Wet forests are full of plants, fungi and animals that depend on moisture. The same rains that made life difficult made the food supply rich. Ancient humans made a calculation, probably not consciously, but through the drift of populations toward resources, that the difficulty of surviving wet conditions was worth the abundance those conditions produced. This is a fundamentally different relationship with weather than the one most modern humans have. We experience rain as an interruption, something that cancels plans and ruins days. Ancient humans experienced rain as a condition, one that required management, created opportunities and demanded skill, but not one that was alien or inherently threatening. It was part of the world they lived in. They were part of it too. The waterproofed hide that carried ember, the angled branches, shedding water in overlapping layers, the group huddled around a fire, in a structure that someone spent 3 hours building before the storm hit, based on a sky reading that said, "The weather was changing the south-facing slope, deliberately chosen because it drains faster. The food cache, buried weeks earlier for exactly this kind of week." All of it points to the same conclusion. Ancient humans didn't just survive rain, they built a civilization of techniques, knowledge, and social structures, specifically designed to manage it. And that civilization that accumulated practical intelligence about how a wet world works was more sophisticated, more finely calibrated to actual conditions than almost any modern person gives it credit for. We have Gore-Tex now. We have insulated walls and central heating, and weather radar and drainage systems that move rainwater away from our buildings before we even notice it arrived. But we built all of that because somewhere in our deep past, someone spent a very long, very wet night figuring out that water runs downhill, that smoke keeps the inside of a shelter dry, that certain animal fats make leather almost waterproof, and that staying close to other, warm humans is the difference between making it to morning. And not every technology we use to manage rain today is downstream of that wet, cold fire-lit night. They figured it out first, without any of the tools we take for granted, using nothing but time, attention, accumulated knowledge, and the stubborn refusal of the human species to simply give up and get rained on. That's not primitive survival. That's the foundation everything else was built on.